The UK government has announced the first round of geoengineering experiments that they will be funding. Now, the experiments will include ways of blocking sunlight to slow global heating, and ARIA, which is the UK science funding agency, has set aside £56 million for the programme. The plan to fund geoengineering experiments has always been very controversial. Back in March, two leading climate scientists, Raymond Pierre Humbert and Michael Mann, warned the UK's gamble on solar geoengineering was like using aspirin for cancer. But the government is pressing ahead with the projects. And what has been announced this week is the specific trials that will be funded. So this is from The Guardian. The ARIA-funded experiments include sending a weather balloon into the stratosphere above the US or UK. Milligram samples of non-toxic mineral dust will be exposed to the high-altitude conditions and then recovered to assess how the particles' properties change with time. So I assume this is for stratospheric aerosol injection. It goes on. Another 3 experiments will test how seawater sprays or electrical charges delivered by drones can seed tiny water droplets, making clouds over the oceans reflect more sunlight. And they say one will expand current work over the Great Barrier Reef, which is in crisis because of global heating, and may reach 100 square kilometres in scale, while another will take place on the UK coast. A 5th experiment will involve pumping water onto sea ice in Canada in winter, reaching up to 1 kilometre square in scale. The water will freeze and preserve the ice sheet for longer in summer. Bright white ice reflects far more sunlight than the dark ocean revealed when sea ice is lost to warming waters. And the ARIA programme will also fund various modelling teams to investigate the impact of geoengineering on climate and ecosystems, especially in developing countries, to determine the feasibility of sunshades placed into orbit to reflect the sun. And there will be further teams working on the ethics and governance associated with geoengineering. Now, as I say, this is incredibly contentious among the scientific community. One very prominent scientist, though, who is welcoming the decision is Sir David King. David King was the chief scientific advisor to the UK government between the years 2000 and 2007. And from 2013 to 2017, he was special representative for climate change to the Foreign Secretary. David King has long been an outspoken advocate for tough climate action. In 2004, he made headlines with the claim that climate change was a bigger threat to the world than terrorism. And since leaving government, he has continued his climate advocacy, setting up the Climate Crisis Advisory Group and the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge University, where he's been an advocate for using marine cloud brightening to refreeze the Arctic. Now, my conversation with David covered many areas, including why he believes China has an excellent record on climate, contrary to many critics. But I began by asking what he made of the UK announcement about geoengineering.
I'm absolutely delighted. I think this is exactly what I've been pushing for 3-4 years now. So we finally got to the point where ARIA is properly funding a series of experiments which I think are critically important.
And the UK does seem to be sort of taking a lead on this issue. As far as I understand, no other government is sort of investing this much money in this many different technologies. I mean, have you had a role in that? Do you think this is partly sort of the influence of the organisations you've begun?
I think it's probably had an impact. Let's just recall we're in a very different situation today than we were in the year 2000, in the sense that all of these challenges are now with us. Before, we were talking about the theoretical predictions of these extreme weather events, and now they're happening. The reason I'm emphasizing the importance of these extreme weather events is because, frankly, if we got to net zero over the next 5 years, we've still got a tremendous challenge ahead of us, because we're getting positive feedback effects from the loss of ice, particularly over the area around the North Sea, Greenland, etc., the North Pole. The loss of ice there during the polar summer is now threatening the whole planet. And the same is happening at Antarctica. We're reaching the point where it's not just an option that we look at these geoengineering, you're calling them, I always call them biomimicry experiments, that we need these in order to buy time to get ourselves down to removing fossil fuel dependence from the whole world. So we need much more time. And if we just sit back and say it's fine, we can stop using fossil fuels over the next 30 years, that's not going to be good enough.
And so could you just talk me through one of the technologies I know you've been in favor of, which is marine cloud brightening? And then the other technology that gets lots of press and lots of interest is stratospheric aerosol injection. So could you sort of take us through both of those?
Right, so I think marine cloud brightening is a good potential technology. What we're doing there is using a biomimicry process. How are white clouds formed over the ocean? When there's a bit of a storm at sea, tiny droplets of seawater are created. Those tiny droplets in the hot sun, when the wind is blowing upwards from the blue sea that has been heating up under the effect of the sunshine, it carries these tiny droplets up 6,000 feet more. In that wind that takes them up, they lose their water, and you're left with a single crystal of ice from each droplet. That cloud of crystals now picks up water vapor from the atmosphere, and then you have a white cloud. If the crystals are small enough, if they're too big, you've got a black cloud. You want a white cloud that will reflect sunlight away while the sun is shining. So I think we know how it's done. We know what we need to do is create droplets of the right size. And the work going on here in the engineering department in Cambridge is all focused on how we can deliver water droplets with a very narrow size distribution and get that to function energetically in a feasible way. What we can't do is use too much energy in any of these projects. So we need to minimize energy production in all of them. So marine cloud brightening, I think, is a very promising technique. There are other means of reflecting sunlight away, and the favored is putting sulfates into the stratosphere. That is a controversial process. I'm actually saying to you, I don't think marine cloud brightening is at all controversial. But if we put sulfates into the stratosphere, there are two probable things that could happen. One is that we're looking at the whole planet and not just a regional area. And that whole planet operation means that we might, and there's probably a low chance of this, end the monsoons in India. And India depends critically for its food production on monsoons. That would be disastrous. So there are difficult unseen events, and it's difficult to carry out experiments that will eliminate these possibilities. But the operation with sulfates also has a problem. We've got rid of the CFCs, which were destroying the ozone layer and creating that ozone hole over the Antarctic. The Antarctic ozone hole is now closing up as a result of this good action. But if we put sulfates into the stratosphere, what will it do to the ozone layer? So we've got to look out for all of these unintended consequences or consequences that we can see as low likelihood, but even a low likelihood may happen. That's just a good illustration of why experiments are necessary. And I'm not ruling out experiments on sulfates. They must be done, and they've got to be done very carefully.
And the idea that we should do experiments, we should work out what would happen if we were to sort of deploy these types of techniques, that might seem relatively uncontroversial. It's not uncontroversial in the scientific community. So you've got some very distinguished climate scientists, Raymond Pierre Humbert and Michael Mann. Michael Mann, especially, I've sort of known of him as a climate scientist, a very distinguished one for a very long time. They both wrote in The Guardian earlier in the year that the UK's gamble on solo geoengineering is like using aspirin for cancer. And they say sort of even testing these ideas is dangerous because it sort of will encourage people to then deploy them. We don't have the governance to do that. And they say it's a dangerous distraction because it might encourage us to think that we can continue sort of producing carbon dioxide because ultimately one of these techno fixes will come along. I suppose, what's your response to people like this? And also, I suppose, a follow-up, why is it the case that really smart people who I think agree with you sort of on most of what you say, sort of fundamentally disagree with you on this issue? How should we make sense of that?
Yes, it's quite a difficult one. I would say what what you've left out of their objections is a very important one, which is that if we're very successful at doing all these things, cooling the Earth by reflecting sunlight away from it, or capturing greenhouse gases at scale, billions of tons a year, we can go on using fossil fuels. So the first thing is this risk that the fossil fuel lobby will be empowered by this. And there is some truth in this. We have seen, for example, in the last two COP meetings, and both of those COP meetings were in oil-rich countries, we've seen that even the president of the COP was using this kind of statement that we'll carry on needing oil going well into the future, and we can capture all the greenhouse gases emerging. So there's the moral risk associated with being able to prove that we can do this. The real risk, and it's a very big ethical risk, is that we believe we can tackle everything by simply switching away from fossil fuels. And I do know that several of my critics in the past have over the last few months changed their minds. In other words, what we've seen in 2023 and 2024 has been a dramatic rise in global temperatures. We went up from 1.3 to 1.5. We're now at 1.65 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. And we have also seen an amazing increase in the heat of the surface of the oceans. The ocean surfaces have never increased as rapidly as they did in 2023. 2024, it's still high. It doesn't look like it's coming down. So what we have is all of the risks we've been worrying about, I've been worrying about for 7, 8 years, are now coming to be. And I am saying to you, some of those scientists I know are changing their minds on this issue.
And that's interesting because you're saying they're changing their minds. As far as I understand it, I've sort of read other people who sort of have your position, who say that there are lots of scientists who agree with you but don't want to say it because it's a taboo and they think that they might sort of find themselves on the wrong side of other significant people's opinions. Do you think there are lots of scientists out there sort of holding their tongues even though they agree with you?
I mean, to be honest, I've had several discussions and I can't quite get at what these people are really worrying about. I do know that there are a number of social scientists who have been very influential in this issue, in which they're saying it is an ethical matter and we shouldn't even allow the experiments to be conducted. I think the number of practical scientists who understand that as scientists, we must never advocate for deploying unproven interventions. Right? If you're a practicing scientist, you're not going to push something into the marketplace to be used in some way if it has an intervention that's going to be negative. So I think that is an understanding that scientists have. And I do believe the argument is rapidly disappearing because of the need for what we're proposing. I'm just delighted that despite all of this disagreement, the British government has the courage to go ahead and fund this through ARIA. But let's face it, ARIA is funding explorative research. It is not funding work that will be rolled out to scale.
I wanted also to talk about, I suppose, how you relate to the broader green movement. I was, in preparation for this interview, listening to a Desert Island Discs with you from 2005. Excellent music taste, I have to say. Great choices. But one thing that you also talked about there was your support for nuclear energy. And I suppose that was something that really put you on the wrong side of Greenpeace or other green NGOs who've always been opposed to nuclear energy. I think now people are sort of starting to potentially reconsider it to some degree. Now you're advocating for geoengineering. And again, this is something which, as far as I understand, the green NGOs and the green movement generally is very, very skeptical of, and often is in outright opposition to. What's your take on sort of the green movement and the positions it takes when it comes to tackling climate change?
So I think it's very easy to understand if we go back to nuclear energy, that people who never believed that there was a good, peaceful use of nuclear energy, which is what we are advocating. And of course, you can point to all of the risks associated with nuclear energy. What do you do with the waste? And the waste is still very radioactively active, and it's going to be active for hundreds of years. So the disposal of waste is a problem. The relative risk, and we all know about the Chernobyl accident, for example. So it is clear that caution has to be taken. However, I just need to point out every time there's been a nuclear incident in the sense of loss of radioactive material or whatever, the regulations around the world for building nuclear power stations has been tightened up and tightened up. This is why nuclear energy, which was going to be the cheapest form of electricity available, that's why it is now so expensive, because the regulatory process is so tight. The parallel I would give you on that is jet air flying. Right? We have fewer and fewer accidents year on year because of the tightening of regulations, and that tightening of regulations pushes up the cost of producing these aircraft. But I think the overall argument is we need to examine what is required for a manageable future for humanity. And as soon as we ask that question, then if I can stay with nuclear energy for a moment, we were recently, Climate Crisis Advisory Group was recently in China in October last year, and Chinese are in the process of introducing their 103rd nuclear power station. I applaud that. What China has decided to do is to, as soon as possible, leave fossil fuels in the ground and produce all of their electricity from renewables, nuclear, and hydropower. And in each case, they are now world leaders. In nuclear, easily world leaders, but also in the others in terms of deployment.
They're also investing in coal, so they're still building quite a lot of coal power plants, aren't they? That's always the critique of China.
So we produced a detailed report on what China is doing, and a lot of people are pointing a finger at them saying they're investing in new coal-fired power stations. That is true. But what they're not reporting is that all of the old nuclear power stations are being shut down because they were so inefficient in producing kilowatt hours per ton of coal. So the new power stations that they're using are much more efficient. They would stop using coal if they could. The problem is they are, if you like, hoist with their own petard. The estimate in our report is that between 2000 and 2020, 800 to 850 million people in China were taken out of poverty. In that process, they've created a new middle class of 850 million people who are all demanding the amount of electricity we have. Since 2010, their coal usage has virtually plateaued, and all of the additional electricity comes from renewables, nuclear, and hydropower. So China is unfairly dealt with as a problem. They are setting an example to the rest of the world, I would say.
And a slightly different topic. So you were chief scientific advisor under Tony Blair for, I think, almost a decade. He has now come out and caused lots of controversy and annoyed lots of people by saying we're moving to net zero too quickly. What's your response to that? And I suppose, do you understand where he was coming from? What was going on there?
I have published a response to his foreword that he wrote to a report that was produced by the Tony Blair Institute. And the foreword was extremely unhelpful. And that's what I've said in the Guardian article. And you might have heard that Tony Blair has now backed down on what he said. What he said in the preface is not in the article itself. So somehow he put a viewpoint in there, and you just quoted it very well. And there is a potential problem because Tony has moved away from the decision-making process in the British government, and I would say he's out of step with it. He's unfamiliar with his own achievements. I had to repeat in my response that we have reduced our emissions by 54%, led by Tony Blair. I mean, I was just the figure behind him, but it was Tony Blair who was taking the world leadership position on climate change at that time. So I think, it's a hiccup in the process. It's all over now. The little fuss is all over, and we can all move on.
And finally, I suppose you're someone with sort of vast experience within government and sort of studying the science of climate change. Do you see yourself as an optimist or a pessimist in terms of sort of how terrified people should be of what's going to happen over the next few decades? Do you kind of feel like humanity, we're innovative people, we've had crises before and we'll probably come up with some kind of solution, even if we do it in a somewhat messy way? Or are you sort of struggling not to fall into some form of climate doom?
So I'm never going to fall into a climate doom. I don't think I can afford to do that, Michael. I don't think any of us can, because if we just fall into a climate doom, we're just going to let it roll over us. And I'm in no position to do that. I really am keen to see that our civilization continues for as long as we can look back at our civilization, which is about 3,000 years. We can look back in Greece to the origins of much of our civilization. I think we should be able to look forward to another 3,000 years. Let's try to make that happen. Now, I think the situation, however, means that over the years since the 2000, my tune has changed. I was saying we just got to use less and less fossil fuels. Now I'm saying, yes, we've got to do that far more quickly, but we also have to take on board all of these other technologies that are needed. And what is more, every city and every region of the world, every state, every country needs a climate resilience policy based on the best projections from science, because each city is faced with different challenges. Each region is faced with different challenges. If I tell you the way in which sea levels are rising today, we're estimating that the country of Vietnam, 85% of the land mass will be under seawater at least once a year in 25 years' time. That's a very short period of time. And that's the third biggest rice producer in the world. And the other rice producers are Indonesia and China. All of their rice paddy fields effectively are close to sea level as well. So we're looking at potential crises on the immediate horizon.